He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
What happens to your pension if you live on a boat? Can you invest in gold through your KiwiSaver? Those are some of the questions we'll be tackling on this, the first episode of No Stupid Questions for 2026. Your questions kept coming over the break, which is great, so we've got lots to work with, but please keep sending them, questions@rnz.co.nz. I'm joined by Justin Gregory.
Happy New Year. We can still say that, eh?
I reckon I'm still saying that, even when I've forgotten whether I've said it to someone already. I just go for it again.
So Happy New Year, everybody. Off we go.
Yes, just a reminder, I'm Susan Edmunds, I'm RNZ's money correspondent. I can't give personalised financial advice, so this is just general information. And if you want some personal information, you should go to a qualified financial advisor.
And our first question is from Rick, who wants to know about gold. So do I. He says, I asked our KiwiSaver provider some time back if there was a gold portfolio for KiwiSaver to invest in. However, I was advised no. Do you perhaps know why this is? Is there a way to divert KiwiSaver funds into a personalised independent portfolio? In this way, I can select the portfolios that I believe will grow outside of the stock market's properties and so on and so on. Whew, bit going on there.
Yes, there are a few questions within this one.
Gold's a really buzzy investment right now, eh?
Yes, it had a huge year last year and so far this year too, actually. And silver as well. I spoke to an outlet in Wellington that sells both recently, and they say they've had people coming in and buying piles of silver coins, which I thought was a nice image. It's one of those investments that people go to when they're worried about things like inflation and geopolitics, and those are both things that we have hanging around at the moment still. In terms of Rick's question, there are a few providers like Sharesies and Craig's that let KiwiSaver members choose where they invest a proportion of their KiwiSaver money. So they don't let you put your whole lot into one particular thing that you pick, but if you are with one of their DIY options, you can put, I think it's about 10% of your portfolio into the investments that you choose. And Greg Smith, who's an investment specialist at Generate, which is another KiwiSaver provider, said some offer gold ETFs, which could be a way to get some access to gold if that's what you want. I would recommend getting some advice, though, to find a KiwiSaver provider that's a good fit for you, because self-selecting can be a bit riskier. If it's something you want to do, there are providers that let you do it, and then it's just a matter of working out whether you can get exposure to the assets that you want within that.
Okay, we get a lot of questions about the pensions, have done since we begun, and it looks like it's going to be another year for those questions too.
Yes, I always used to think that it was kind of boring. Like, you either get the pension or you don't, and that's it. But I've discovered that there is so much more to it and that people need lots of information, and finding it is quite hard to access. So it has been really interesting to dig into all the questions about it.
Yeah, and in this case, Lorinda asks, I'll be 65 this February. I've had notification from my RD that I need to apply for New Zealand superannuation. As I'm continuing to work, at least for the next 5 years, and I have a mortgage to pay, I'm wondering what this means for my tax rate. Should I claim it or wait until I've retired?
So you can claim New Zealand Super. You don't need to wait. There's no income test or asset test on the pension, so anyone can claim it, no matter what they're earning. And you can't get back pay, so you might as well claim it as early as you can, because if you decide you're going to claim it next year, you can't get the money that you should have had this year. If you have a job, you might find that NZ Super needs to be taxed with a secondary tax rate. This doesn't mean, or shouldn't mean, that you pay more tax overall. It just reflects that the pension is coming in on top of your existing income, and that might push you into a higher tax bracket because of that. So if you end up paying too much tax, you will get it back at the end of the tax year. And you shouldn't be worse off for having claimed New Zealand Super in any situation that I can think of, because New Zealand's tax system means you only pay the higher rates of tax on the higher amounts that you earn. So if your pension means your total annual income is now over, say, $53,501 a year, which is such a clunky tax bracket amount. But anyway, if it was a little bit under that threshold and now it's a bit above, it's only the bit above that's charged at the 30% rate. The rest remains taxed as it was previously.
Now, Brett has a question that, to be honest, sounds a bit dodgy on first listen. Brett says, I've read your column about people's questions for some time, but now I have one for you. I'm a GST registered engineering contractor, but sometimes I work for wages. A particular company I've worked on wages for a couple of times now, when I've asked if I could get KiwiSaver while I'm with them, they told me they would have to take $2 to $3 an hour off my hourly rate. Is this correct? Doesn't sound correct.
No, something doesn't sound right here. I went to talk to Anna-Marie Lockyer, who's Chief Executive at Pi Funds, about this one.
If you're truly working on wages as an employee, then the 3% has to be paid on top of your gross pay. So the employer can't reduce your agreed hourly rate just to fund their KiwiSaver contribution, unless, of course, your original pay agreement explicitly states that your hourly rate was total remuneration. But that's not very common for waged roles. So I guess for this individual, if their agreed rate was $40 an hour as wages, then the employer would have to pay them 40 hours gross and then 3% on top. And they certainly can't say, we'll only pay KiwiSaver if you drop your rate, because that's effectively making the individual pay the company's legal obligation, which isn't allowed unless they're contracted out of it through total rem.
But she says it's worth checking where you're an employee and where you're working as a contractor.
Just ensuring certainty in terms of the relationship with the company, because if they were working as a contractor for an hourly rate, which they may construe as wages, as opposed to wages as an employee for a contract, then of course employers don't have to pay KiwiSaver to contractors. It's usually priced into the rate if you're on a contracting arrangement, and therefore reducing the rate to accommodate the KiwiSaver could be seen as lawful because contractors negotiate a total rate, not wages as an employee.
Oh, okay, all right. But if he was a true employee, then they really should have already been sorting KiwiSaver, right?
Yeah, look, if they're a true employee, they'll have a contract in place, and that contract would have to be very, very clear in writing that their hourly rate was on a total rem basis. But that's not very common with wages, like with waged employees.
She says a good place to start could be to write to the employer and confirm the situation with some references to the relevant rules on the IRD website. But review your contract first to make sure you're on really solid ground there.
And we've got a question from Gary who says, what if I retire aboard a yacht? Yeah, what if I retire aboard a yacht with no residence in country with reciprocal agreements? That's what this question's about. Yeah, yep, go on. Susan?
Through last year, I had so many questions come in about various situations in which people wanted to know whether they could get the pension. It was people saying, can we go to Australia and get the pension there? Can we go to the UK? And I think this one must be the peak of those questions. The answer is, if you're going to be overseas for more than 6 months, you need to apply to MSD if you want to keep your pension going. That's the basic starting point. You need to do this at least 6 weeks before you leave New Zealand. If you haven't notified MSD and you're away more than 6 months, they might ask for the whole sum that you've been paid in pension in that time to be returned. So very important to tick that one off. What you can get if you are eligible for New Zealand superannuation but living overseas depends on the country that you're going to live in. So some countries like Australia have reciprocal agreements with New Zealand, which means that applications for New Zealand super can be made while you're resident in that country. And New Zealand residents can count for pension eligibility in the country that there's the agreement with. But MSD advises that if you're going to a country that doesn't have an agreement with New Zealand, you might be able to get your pension. The amount you receive would depend on the number of months you've lived in New Zealand between the ages of 20 and 65. So basically, the best thing to do in this case before you go off on your yacht will be to get in touch with MSD well before you leave to find out how the rules will apply to your individual case.
Okay, we're switching to another tangent now with a question about GST and capital gains. Stephen says he had a mining permit and wrote off the land. On retiring, he had to deregister from GST and found the land was now worth a lot more. Does he have to pay GST on the difference?
For this one, I went to Alan Bullot, who's an expert at GST. I actually interrupted him preparing to attend a wedding in Wanaka, so sorry about that, Alan. He was very kind and talked me through this. He says, when it comes to GST, capital gains are not something that's captured by that system. So what matters is whether you've made revenue from your taxable activity, whether that's a sale or a deemed sale, which is what happens when you deregister for GST, that's the deemed sale. He says GST would probably apply in this situation if the mining permit was part of the activity that had been GST taxable while you were doing it. He says this is something that people need to understand if they're registered for GST because they're running an Airbnb or something like that too. He says people sometimes get a shock because they might have bought the property zero rated, so no GST changed hands, and then they might have been claiming back GST on rates and things like that along the way, and then find they have to pay 15% GST when they sell it 20 years later to someone who isn't registered for GST. He says in some cases people have the ability to not claim GST on the house itself and just be in the GST universe for income, which can help avoid that. But that wouldn't work here because the rules are quite recent and wouldn't generally be for something like a mining permit. So his advice, putting all that aside, is to sit with your accountant and have a look at your overall state of financial affairs, which sounds sensible to me because I got quite confused going to that.
Okay, moving on from the GST universe, we're now on to the disappointment gap. Susan, you've been writing about the disappointment gap lately, which might be affecting some businesses. What is a disappointment gap, please?
Yes. So this refers to something that happens in an economic recovery, which we're starting to get now, finally, at last. Businesses think that the next quarter will be better or the next month or whatever. And then while the next month is better, it's maybe not as much as has been hoped. So Shamubeel says the latest quarterly survey of business optimism shows it's really persistent at the moment, that disappointment gap, as lots of businesses are kind of holding on, hoping for good times ahead. And it's happening, but it's not happening maybe as fast as anyone would like them to at the moment.
And that's tough for them, yeah. Are there wider issues here as well?
I think it's probably what's behind a few of the closures that we're seeing at the moment. It's been a rough start to the year with, a number of businesses announcing that they're closing their doors, some around me. And some of that is maybe that the Christmas bump in spending didn't really come for some of them in the way they might have hoped. And some might be that the recovery isn't happening yet as much as they want it to. I think people often talk about the economy as this one thing, but in reality, it's just a lot of people and businesses doing what they do. And some will feel things improve before others, some will get a big rebound, and others might not go back to where they were before. So things do cycle, but they don't turn around instantly. And Shamubeel told me he thinks that the rate of closure of businesses could actually get a bit worse before it gets better. But hopefully towards the middle of the year, we'll start having some cheerier conversations.
Speaking of the Christmas bump, now, somewhere back in the midst of time, or actually mid-December 2025, before we went on holiday, we had a question for you about that. We asked what spending increase is normal at Christmas. What's the Christmas bump, in other words?
Yeah, so Christmas is obviously a big shopping period for retailers. I've heard things like it's responsible for almost 20% of retail turnover. Worldline data shows there was $4.09 billion spent on core retail merchants in November and then $4.702 billion in December. But this year was a bit weak for Christmas and Christmas-ish spending. Boxing Day was down more than 12% on the year before on that Worldline data. But what I've been hearing is that retailers are saying Black Friday is now their busy time, which is fine, I guess, except that it means that they're already doing that discounting before Christmas. So maybe that puts their margins under more pressure overall.
Have you seen hot cross buns are for sale in supermarkets now, January?
That's not okay. No, that's not acceptable.
It is okay because hot cross buns are fantastic, but having them on offer in January... Yeah, it's a bit of a stretch, isn't it? Anyway, right. Okay, now our question for this week. In what year did waterbeds and wine cooler drop out of the CPI?
And did it happen at the same time? Was everyone drinking wine cooler in their waterbeds until they suddenly weren't? I remember my parents' waterbed was so fun to roll around on, but then it had a heater and it would stop randomly and then they'd have a super cold bed. My bed is a lot less admin. So
if you have an answer to what year waterbeds and wine cooler dropped out of the CPI, send your answers to questions@rnz.co.nz, as well as your general questions for us, please.
Yes, anything money, spending, saving, investing, we want them all. Bye for now.
See ya.
No Stupid Questions with Susan Edmunds was written and presented by Susan Edmunds. That's me. Justin Gregory is the producer. The engineer is Leanne Smith. Thanks to Rick, Lorinda, Brett, Gary and Stephen for their questions, and Anna Marie Lockyer, MSD, Greg Smith and Alan Bullot for their answers. Follow and listen to No Stupid Questions with Susan Edmunds on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or any podcast app so you don't miss an episode.